1931. An afternoon in Staffordshire. The Prince of Wales arrives at the Harts Hill Orthopaedic Hospital to open a new wing. He has done this kind of thing 100 times. Ribbon cuttings, handshakes, the careful, practiced warmth of a man trained since birth to be watched. He cuts the ribbon. He walks through the wards, speaks to the staff. And when he leaves, according to those who were there, he is crying. The wing was called the Rosemary Ednam Memorial Extension. That name meant nothing to most of Britain. It meant everything to the man unveiling it. Rosemary, Viscountess Ednam, had not been dead long. The circumstances of her death were violent enough to make every front page in England. But the tears were not about how she died. They were about what she had been to him, and what she might have become if his father had not said no. The detail that stopped me when I first came across this story was the timing. Not the death itself, which I will get to. The timing of everything around it. Because what happened to Rosemary and what happened because of Rosemary are two very different stories. One is about a woman, the other is about a monarchy. Her full name was Lady Rosemary Millicent Sutherland Leveson Gower. She was born in a castle on the coast of Scotland that had belonged to her family for centuries. Her father controlled more land than some European countries. She nursed wounded soldiers in the fields of northern France. She was, briefly and secretly, the woman the Prince of Wales wanted to marry. His parents vetoed the match, and less than 12 years later, she was dead at 36. Her body was found in an orchard in Kent, identified only by her string of pearls. Every woman the prince chose after Rosemary was married, the last of them cost him the throne. In 1900, the Duke of Sutherland owned approximately 1,358,000 acres of land. To put that in proportion, it was larger than the entire county of Suffolk. Most of it sat in the Highlands, a long sweep of coastline and moorland from the north coast to near Inverness. The Sutherlands had held it for over 400 years. Their seat was Dunrobin Castle, perched on a raised terrace above the sea in the parish of Golspie. The building looks more like a French palace than a fortress. Towers, turrets, 189 rooms, formal gardens dropping in terraces toward the coast, laid out in the style of Versailles. It had been rebuilt in the 1840s by Sir Charles Barry, the same architect who designed the Houses of Parliament, and the scale of the project made clear that the Sutherlands saw themselves as European aristocrats, not merely Highland chieftains. The money came from several directions: coal and ironstone in the English Midlands, canal investments, railway shares bought early enough to matter, and the Bridgewater fortune, inherited through marriage, which alone had made the first Duke one of the wealthiest men in Britain. He was described at the time of his death as a leviathan of wealth. By the time Rosemary was born, they kept 3 residences: Dunrobin in the Highlands, Trentham Hall in Staffordshire, and Stafford House in London, which you would know today as Lancaster House. But in certain parts of the country, the Sutherland name was not spoken with admiration. The first Duke and his wife, Elizabeth, Countess of Sutherland, had overseen what became known as the Highland clearances on their estates. Beginning in the early 1800s, thousands of tenants were evicted and resettled in coastal villages. The interiors were turned over to sheep, which produced higher rents. The methods were often brutal. Homes were burned. Some families had days to leave, others had less. The removals reshaped entire communities. Villages that had existed for generations were emptied within weeks, and the people who had lived there were expected to take up fishing, a trade most of them had never practiced. A 100-foot statue of the first Duke still stands on the hilltop above Golspie. The inscription calls him a judicious, kind, and liberal landlord, erected by a mourning and grateful tenantry. Efforts to tear it down have continued into the present century. Whether you see it as a monument or an insult depends entirely on which side of the eviction your ancestors were on. I mention this because it matters for what comes later. The wealth Rosemary was born into did not arrive quietly. It arrived through displacement, and the memory of that was still sharp when she was a child. The Sutherlands were powerful and rich. In parts of the Highlands, they were also despised. And reputations, as Rosemary would learn, do not stay in one place. They follow a family wherever it goes. Rosemary's father was Cromarty Sutherland Leveson Gower, the fourth Duke of Sutherland. He inherited the title in 1892 and held it until his death in 1913. By the time he took charge, the great estates were no longer what they had been. Agricultural rents across Britain were falling. Maintaining 3 enormous households had become a burden even for a duke. Cromarty began selling off properties. Trentham Hall was let go. Stafford House followed, bought by the soap manufacturer William Lever. He was not a man building an empire. He was a man managing a slow, dignified decline. He owned a steam yacht called the Catania and held the Order of the Garter, but the direction of his life was contraction, not expansion. Her mother was Millicent, born Lady Millicent St. Clair Erskine, eldest daughter of the 4th Earl of Rosslyn. They married in 1884 on Millicent's 17th birthday. Millicent would prove to be the more formidable of the two, but that story belongs to the next chapter. Rosemary was the youngest of 4 children. The eldest, Victoria, died before her 3rd birthday. Then came George, who would inherit the dukedom, and Alistair, who would not live past 31. Death came early in this family. It was a pattern that would hold. Rosemary Millicent Sutherland Leveson Gower was born at Dunrobin Castle on the 9th of August, 1893. She arrived into a fortune, a name, and a set of family connections that would, within 25 years, cost her a crown. The painting hangs in Madrid now, in the Thyssen-Bornemisza Museum. It is over 8 feet tall. John Singer Sargent painted it in 1904, and the woman in it is standing in a garden, one hand resting on a fountain, wearing a dress covered in roses and a laurel wreath in her red hair. She stares straight at the viewer. She looks like someone who has never been uncomfortable in her life. Within 10 years, she would be dragging wounded soldiers out of a besieged city in Belgium. Millicent Sutherland Leveson Gower, Duchess of Sutherland, was 17 when she married. That was not unusual for the time. What was unusual was what she did with the position. By her mid-20s, she had established herself as a leading London hostess. Her parties were the kind that people talked about for years. She corresponded with writers, politicians, and diplomats, and founded the North Staffordshire Cripples Aid Society. She wrote novels, short stories, and a play in blank verse, publishing under the pen name Erskine Gower. Foreign ambassadors came to her dinner table. So did members of Parliament. None of this was expected. Most of it was self-invented. The Duke died at Dunrobin in June of 1913. Millicent was 45. She had been married for 29 years and had raised 3 surviving children. For most women of her class and era, this would have been the start of a quiet widowhood, managing the estates, attending charity events, watching the gardens. Millicent lasted about 14 months. On the 4th of August, 1914, Britain declared war on Germany. 5 days later, Millicent was on her way to Belgium. She had persuaded the French Minister of War to exempt her from regulations forbidding foreigners in French military hospitals. Winston Churchill helped her overcome the resistance of the Royal Army Medical Corps, and with 8 trained nurses and 1 surgeon, she set up what would become the No. 9 Red Cross Hospital in a convent in Namur called Les Sœurs de Notre Dame. Then the German army arrived. The hospital was overwhelmed with casualties. Namur fell. Millicent and her unit were trapped behind enemy lines. She managed to escape back to England, where she wrote a short book about the experience called 6 Weeks at the War. It sold well. She did not stay home to enjoy the sales. By the summer of 1915, she was back in France. The No. 9 hospital reopened near Calais, this time in tents pitched in an oat field, and it would remain operational for 3 more years. The unit became known for its early adoption of the Carrel d'Aquin treatment, a method of irrigating wounds with diluted antiseptic that cut infection rates sharply. The French painter Victor Tardieu, who had volunteered as a soldier, produced 10 oil paintings of the hospital in the field. They hang today in the Florence Nightingale Museum. The part of her story that I cannot quite reconcile is the distance between the woman in the sergeant portrait and the woman in the oat field. Not that people cannot change, but the speed of it, the decisiveness. There was nothing cautious about her contribution. She went to a besieged city, not a safe posting behind the lines. She was shelled. She was trapped behind enemy lines and talked her way out. By the time the armistice came, she was past 50 and had earned the French Croix de Guerre and the British Royal Red Cross. After the armistice, Millicent's personal life became less steady. She married twice more. The second husband, a military officer named Percy Desmond Fitzgerald, proved unfaithful. That marriage ended in 1919. The third, to Lieutenant Colonel George Hawes, ended in 1925. Both were short, both were public, and both would, in time, become part of a case against her daughter that Millicent herself never saw coming. She lived the rest of her life mostly in France. She died at Oriol, near the Spanish border, in August of 1955, at 87 years old. Her ashes were brought back to Dunrobin. But in 1917, all of that was still ahead. The hospital near Calais was running, the wards were full, and Rosemary had followed her mother to France. The Prince of Wales had been in France, on and off, since late 1914. He had joined the Grenadier Guards that summer, at the age of 20, expecting to fight. What he got instead was a staff position, safely behind the lines, attached to the commander of the British Expeditionary Force. He spent nearly 3 years watching other men do what he was not permitted to do. It ate at him. He begged Lord Kitchener to send him forward. Kitchener reportedly told him that his death would be a disaster, but his capture would be worse. So Edward toured the trenches. He visited casualty clearing stations. He saw the mud and the gas and the stretchers. He was never allowed to stay. The frustration was constant. He wanted to be treated like an officer. He was treated like something breakable. By the summer of 1917, he was 23 and deeply restless. A prince who wanted to be ordinary, surrounded by men dying for a country he would one day rule, and unable to share their risk. Whether that restlessness made him a better person or simply a more volatile one is something that has never quite been settled. Rosemary, meanwhile, had been in the society pages since she was a girl. A duke's youngest child, raised between castles and country houses, presented at court as a debutante. Before the war, her days had followed the expected rhythm of a woman of her rank. She attended charity dinners and country weekends. She moved through the London season because that was what was expected of her. She chose something different. She went to France and took a position as a nurse at the No. 9 Red Cross Hospital near Calais. Not as an administrator, the way Millicent ran things. As a working nurse, dressing wounds, tending to soldiers who had been carried in on stretchers. The work was hard, unglamorous, and unending, and she did it for years. When the armistice came, she was awarded the Associate Royal Red Cross in the birthday honours of 1919. That decoration was not given for showing up. It was given for sustained and competent service under difficult conditions. It was during that summer, 1917, that Edward visited the hospital. Some accounts suggest they had known each other as children, which is plausible given the overlapping circles of the royal court and the upper reaches of the aristocracy. But whatever had passed between them before carried little weight now. This was a different setting, and they were different people. Something about where they met changes the story, I think. This was not a ballroom or a country house weekend. They met in a place where men arrived broken and sometimes did not leave. Rosemary was not performing a social role. She was doing real work in real conditions. Edward, for all his title, had spent 3 years feeling useless. He was drawn to people who were not. They were almost the same age. Edward had turned 23 in June. Rosemary would turn 24 in August. The romance moved quickly. Edward was, by most accounts, intense in his attachments. When he fell in love, he fell entirely, with a kind of emotional need that unsettled the people close to him. Rosemary was not like the women he would later pursue. She was young and single. Unlike anyone who came after her, she was working, not waiting. And she came from a family that, on paper, should have been perfectly acceptable. Her father had been a duke. Her mother had earned the Croix de Guerre. By every measure the court applied, she was a serious candidate. Edward asked her to marry him. Lady Victor Paget, one of Rosemary's closest friends, recalled the moment years later. Rosemary came to her and told her that the prince had proposed. The proposal itself is poorly documented. No correspondence between them has surfaced publicly. No diary entries have come to light. What survives is Paget's account, and the separate confirmation from Lady Harding of Penshurst, whose husband was Assistant Private Secretary to King George V. Harding wrote only that the prince wished to marry, but that there was opposition. Rosemary said yes, but the decision was not hers to make. George V said no. The mechanism was the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, which required the reigning monarch's consent for any marriage of a descendant of George II. Edward could not marry without his father's approval. That approval was sought. It was refused. What makes this difficult to sit with, even now, is that the objection had nothing to do with Rosemary herself. By most accounts, the royal family liked her. She was well-born, well-connected, and serious-minded, and she had served in the war. On her own terms, she was everything the court should have wanted. The problem was not her. It was her family, not her parents, not her siblings, the people who stood behind them in the bloodline, the ones Rosemary had never chosen and could not disown. The first was her half-aunt, Daisy Greville, Countess of Warwick. Her mother and Millicent's mother were the same woman, but their fathers were different, which made Daisy a half-sister to Millicent and a half-aunt to Rosemary. Daisy had been the mistress of King Edward VII for nearly a decade, through the 1890s. That alone might have been survivable. Royal mistresses were a fact of life in that world. What made Daisy unforgivable was what came next. After the king died in 1910, Daisy found herself heavily in debt. She threatened to publish Edward VII's love letters unless the crown made it worth her while. It was, in plain terms, blackmail. The crown's lawyers took the matter to court, and argued that the copyright belonged to the monarch. A British industrialist named Arthur Ducros quietly settled £64,000 of Daisy's debts in exchange for the correspondence. Ducros received a baronetcy for his trouble. The letters were suppressed, but the humiliation was not forgotten. George V had been forced to go to court to stop his father's former mistress from publishing proof of the affair, and that woman was Rosemary's relative. The second problem was closer still. James St. Clair Erskine, the 5th Earl of Rosslyn, was Millicent's brother and Rosemary's uncle. He had inherited an earldom and set about destroying it. He was a compulsive gambler who, by his own later admission, lost over £250,000 at the races and the card tables. He was declared bankrupt in 1897, becoming the first hereditary peer to take to the stage to earn a living. He married 3 times. His second wife was Anna Robinson, an American actress who died in the Manhattan State Hospital for the insane. His memoir, published in 1928 under the title My Gamble with Life, was entirely without remorse. The king looked at this family and saw risk. A half-aunt who had tried to extort the crown, an uncle who was bankrupt, divorced, and infamous. It did not matter that Rosemary was blameless. He was not evaluating a woman. He was evaluating a bloodline. Edward was, according to Lady Victor Paget, bitter and furious. He argued, he pressed. It changed nothing. When Rosemary learned of the decision, she reportedly said that she had never wanted to marry a prince in the first place. Whether that was pride or pain, or simply the most composed thing she could say, nobody now alive can know. What happened next is the part that reaches forward across decades. It was only days after the veto that Edward attended a social gathering hosted by Maud Kerr Smiley. A decade later, Maud would introduce her sister-in-law to London society. The woman's name was Wallis Simpson. The connection between the end of one relationship and the distant beginning of another is almost too precise to be real, but it is documented. And there is a pattern in what followed that no biographer of Edward has been able to ignore. After Rosemary, he never again pursued a woman who was single. Freda Dudley Ward was married to a Liberal Member of Parliament. Thelma Furness was married to a Viscount. Wallis Simpson had been married twice and divorced twice. It was as if the veto had taught him one clean lesson. Single women required his father's permission. Married women did not. The king had refused Rosemary to protect the monarchy. 18 years later, his son abdicated for the twice-divorced American that the refusal had steered him toward. The protection failed, and the damage was set in motion long before anyone saw where it was heading. About a year after the king's refusal, Rosemary married one of Edward's closest friends. The wedding took place on the 8th of March, 1919, at St. Margaret's, Westminster. The groom was William Humble Eric Ward, Viscount Ednam, heir to the earldom of Dudley. He was 25. She was 25. The Ward family had held the earldom since 1860. Ednam's father, the second Earl, had served as Governor-General of Australia and Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. The family was wealthy, traditional, and deeply embedded in English public life. Rosemary was not marrying beneath herself. She was marrying sideways, into a different kind of establishment. Ednam had served in the war and earned the Military Cross. He was, by all available accounts, decent, conventional, and devoted. He was also one of the Prince of Wales's close friends. That detail gives the marriage a quality that is hard to describe without overreading it. Rosemary had been refused by the Crown. She married into the Crown's inner circle. Edward remained part of their lives. There is no record of awkwardness, no reported falling out, no sign that the three of them could not share a room. Whether that speaks well of all of them or merely reflects the codes of their class is a question that depends on how generous you are feeling. Their home was Himley Hall, a country house set in Parkland on the outskirts of Dudley in the West Midlands. The family held 30,000 acres across Staffordshire and Worcestershire. It was not Dunrobin. It did not have 189 rooms or gardens modelled on Versailles. But it was hers, and she filled it. 3 sons arrived in quick succession. William Humble David was born in January of 1920. John Jeremy followed in 1922. Peter Alistair came in 1926. The eldest, William, was given a godfather whose identity says everything about the relationships at work. Edward, Prince of Wales, stood for the boy. The man who had wanted to marry Rosemary agreed to take a formal role in the life of her firstborn child. The 20s were a full decade for this set. Country house weekends and race meetings, dinners in London. Edward was a regular presence. He and Ednam shot together, dined together, travelled in the same circles. The friendship between the two men appeared entirely intact. What I cannot tell, from this distance, is whether any of that carried private weight. Whether Edward, standing at the christening font, felt like kindness, or like something he owed her. The sources give us nothing on this. No letters between them have surfaced. No diary entries. Just the fact that he said yes, and that the arrangement continued as though the veto had been folded into the fabric of their lives without leaving a visible crease. Rosemary took over as president of the North Staffordshire Cripples Aid Society, the organisation her mother had founded years earlier. She attended local fetes, opened charity bazaars, and sat on committees. People in the villages around Himley knew her by name, not just by title. In 1929, she launched a £20,000 appeal for a new outpatients department at the Harts Hill Orthopaedic Hospital, the same institution that would later carry her name in a way she could not have anticipated. In her final months, she was working with an architect on a project in the grounds at Himley, a memorial garden. She chose the layout. She consulted on the plantings. It was the kind of work that assumes you will be there to see it finished. The first death came before Rosemary was born. Her eldest sister, Victoria, lived less than 3 years. Born in 1885, dead by 1888. The cause is not recorded in the sources I have been able to find. By the time Rosemary was born at Dunrobin in 1893, the nursery had already held a child who did not live. Whether anyone spoke about Victoria in the house, or whether her name was folded into the kind of silence that families of that era preferred, there is no way to know. But the space she left was there from the beginning. Rosemary's brother Alistair was the second son, 3 years older than her. They grew up together between Dunrobin and the family's English estates. He served in the war, earned the Military Cross, and married in April of 1918. His wife was Elizabeth Helene Demarest, an American from New York. Her former father-in-law, John George Alexander Leishman, had been a Pittsburgh industrialist and American ambassador to several countries. The Sutherlands were, once again, connected to transatlantic money. In March of 1921, Alistair and Elizabeth's daughter was born. They named her Elizabeth Millicent. She was the only child they would have. 1 month later, Alistair left for a big game expedition in Rhodesia. He contracted malaria and died in a hospital in Johannesburg on the 28th of April, 1921. He was 31 years old. His daughter, who would grow up to become the 24th Countess of Sutherland, never knew him. For Millicent, it was the second child she had outlived. For Rosemary, it was the loss of the sibling closest to her in age and in the rhythm of her childhood. She was 27. She had already lost her father. She had lived through a war, been refused by a king, and rebuilt her life in a different shape. She bore it the way her class and generation bore everything, quietly, without public collapse. But the losses were accumulating, and they were not finished. This is the part I have been putting off. At the end of 1929, the household at Himley numbered 5, Rosemary, Ednam, and 3 boys, aged 9, 7, and 3. It was the fullest the house had been. In December, the middle child, John Jeremy, was riding his bicycle near Himley when he was struck by a truck. He died from his injuries. He was 7 years old. I have not found details beyond that sentence in the records. No newspaper report, no inquest account. Just the bare fact, repeated across several genealogical sources, that a boy named John Jeremy Ward died in December of 1929 at the age of 7, killed in a road accident while cycling. What it meant for Rosemary is not documented either. No letters from this period have surfaced, and no accounts from friends describe how she responded. The only thing the record shows is what she did afterward. The hospital appeal continued. The plans for the memorial garden moved forward. She went on because her 2 remaining sons needed her to, and because it was the only response she had ever been taught. By the spring of 1930, Rosemary was 36, a mother of 2, a war veteran, and a woman shaped by losses she never chose. She did not know that the next one would be hers. It was July. Rosemary was in France, the summer of 1930, 6 months after the death of her son, and the world she moved in carried on as it always did. Ednam had been unwell, and the doctors had recommended the sea air. He was staying at Le Touquet, a resort town on the northern coast that had become a reliable summer destination for the British upper class. The town had been built for exactly this clientele. British money had shaped its golf courses, its racecourse, and its cluster of villas along the shore. It was France, but only just. For families like the Wards, Le Touquet in July was as familiar as the Highlands in September. Rosemary had crossed the channel to be with her husband. She was not alone. A house party was underway at the villa of Mrs. Sigrid Louifler, a society hostess. Among the guests were Frederick Hamilton Temple Blackwood, the Marquess of Dufferin and Ava, and Sir Edward Ward. The gathering was the sort of thing that filled summer calendars at this level. Informal, pleasant. No one would have remembered it if not for what followed. But Rosemary needed to return to England. She had an appointment with the architect working on the memorial garden at Himley, and the project was not something she was prepared to let slip. It had been part of her routine since John Jeremy's death. Something she could shape. Something that held still when everything else did not. Of everything I have read about Rosemary, the detail I keep returning to is what happened next. An earlier flight became available. A Junkers F-13, a single-engine monoplane built for short routes and light passenger loads, was departing Le Touquet that afternoon for Croydon, which at the time served as London's main airport. Rosemary switched to it, apparently without hesitation. She took the earlier plane because it was there and because she wanted to get home. The aircraft carried 6 people, 2 crew and 4 passengers. The pilot was Lieutenant Colonel George Henderson, known as Budgie. The reserve pilot was Charles Shearing. The passengers were Rosemary, Dufferin, Sir Edward Ward, and Mrs. Loeffler. 4 of the 6 came from the same house party. Dufferin was 55, a decorated soldier born in Ottawa while his father served as Governor-General of Canada. He had been Speaker of the Senate of Northern Ireland since the body's creation in 1921. Two of his older brothers had died in earlier wars, one at Wagon Hill during the Boer campaign, the other in the trenches in 1917. His son Basil had married Maureen Guinness of the Brewing dynasty just 18 days before. There were later claims that Edward, Prince of Wales, had been expected on the flight and changed his arrangements at the last moment. This has never been confirmed. What is confirmed is the weather. The 21st of July, 1930, was a poor day to be in the air. Gale force winds, driving rain. Commercial aviation between France and England was still young. The aircraft were small. The routes were short. In bad conditions, pilots relied on visual landmarks and their own judgment. There was no radar and no instrument landing system. When the weather turned, there was very little anyone could do. The Junkers F-13 had been registered only weeks earlier, on the 26th of May. It had logged limited flight hours. At approximately 2:30 on the afternoon of the 21st of July, 1930, the aircraft lifted off from Le Touquet and turned north over the Channel toward England. The Channel crossing was rough but uneventful. Wind and rain battered the plane, but the Junkers held its course and the English coastline appeared through the murk. They continued north across Kent, heading for Croydon. At approximately 25 minutes to 3 on the afternoon of the 21st of July, 1930, people in the village of Meopham heard a sound they later described as an explosion. They looked up. The Junkers was breaking apart in the sky. The tail separated first, then the engine tore away and fell into the driveway of an unoccupied house, narrowly missing a gardener working nearby. The fuselage and one wing came down close to a bungalow. The other wing landed a mile away. The tail section lay in a field 300 yards from the main wreckage. For the people of Meopham, who had been going about an ordinary Monday afternoon, the sky had opened and dropped metal and bodies across their village. 5 of the 6 on board fell from the aircraft and landed in Leyland's orchard. They were all dead. The 6th, the reserve pilot Charles Shearing, was found strapped into his seat in what remained of the cockpit. A village policeman pulled him free and carried him into the bungalow. A retired surgeon who lived nearby arrived quickly. Shearing was alive, but not for long. He died within the hour. There were no survivors. Among the dead were Dufferin, Sir Edward Ward, Mrs. Loeffler, and the pilot Henderson. Rosemary was the 5th. Her body lay in the orchard. That image has stayed with me since I first read it. The pearls. She had been born at Dunrobin Castle, served as a nurse in a war, been proposed to by a future king, and buried a child 6 months earlier. Now she lay in a Kent orchard, recognised only by her pearls. She was 36 years old. Ednam was still in Le Touquet when the news reached him. The Air Ministry launched a formal investigation, led by Major Cooper. The results were made public. This was itself a precedent. No air accident report had ever been published in the United Kingdom before. Cooper concluded that the crash was caused by a phenomenon he termed tail buffeting. At certain airspeeds and under certain wind conditions, the tailplane could enter a cycle of severe vibration, leading to catastrophic structural failure. The tail had broken away in flight. Once that happened, there was nothing the pilot could have done. The Junkers Company and the German government conducted their own investigation and rejected the British finding. They disputed the tail buffeting theory entirely. The disagreement was never formally resolved. The British report remains the more widely accepted account, but the exact cause of the crash is, technically, still contested. The publication of Cooper's report set a course that would eventually lead to the creation of what is now the Air Accidents Investigation Branch. In 1930, That infrastructure did not exist. Cooper worked under pressure from a public that had watched 4 prominent figures and 2 experienced pilots die in a single afternoon. Memorial services were held at St. Margaret's, Westminster, and at Dornoch Cathedral and Golspie Parish Church in the Highlands. The King and Queen sent messages of condolence to the Duke of Sutherland and to Viscount Ednam. Her brother George, the 5th Duke, had now lost both the siblings he had grown up with. The newspapers covered the crash for days. Rosemary was buried in the grounds of Himley Hall, in the Memorial Garden, the one she had been travelling home to finish. In 1931, Edward opened the memorial extension at Hartshill. You already know about the tears. What you do not yet know is what came after them. He did not cut Rosemary's family from his life. He remained close to Ednam. He stayed involved with the boys. His godson William grew up at Himley Hall under the long shadow of a mother he barely remembered, and a godfather whose visits carried a weight nobody in the household could quite name. In early December of 1936, Edward VIII, who had been king for less than a year, spent his final weekend on the throne at Himley Hall, the home where Rosemary had raised her children, the estate where she was buried in the garden she had designed. Of all the houses in England available to him, he chose to spend his last hours as monarch in hers. Whether he and Ednam spoke about Rosemary that weekend is not recorded. The choice of location says enough. On the 11th of December, he signed the instrument of abdication. He renounced the throne to marry Wallis Simpson. Her path into his life could be traced through Maud Kerr Smiley, Frida Dudley Ward, and Thelma Furness, all the way back to a veto in a palace nearly 20 years before. The chain was unbroken. George V's refusal had been meant to protect the crown. Instead, it produced the first voluntary abdication of a British monarch. Edward left the country the following day. He married Wallis in June of 1937 and spent the rest of his life in exile, mostly in France. He died in Paris in 1972. Ednam lived until 1969. He married twice more after Rosemary. He served briefly as a Member of Parliament and inherited the earldom of Dudley in 1932. He was 75 when he died. Their eldest son, William, the prince's godson, inherited the title after his father. He had served in the Royal Hussars during the Second World War and was wounded in action. The Duke of Windsor, as Edward was known after the abdication, remained his godfather for life. William married twice and had 10 children. He died in November of 2013 at the age of 93. He had been Rosemary's child for just over 10.5 years before she was taken from him. Their youngest son, Peter Alistair, lived until 2008. He married Claire Baring, and they had 2 daughters. The elder was Rachel. Rachel Ward was born in 1957 at Cornwall Manor in Oxfordshire. She became a model, then an actress. In 1983, she was cast as Meggie Cleary in the American television miniseries The Thornbirds. The role made her famous. Meggie Cleary is a woman who falls in love with a Catholic priest, a man bound by vows to a life that cannot include her. Their love is real. It is also impossible. He chooses the church. She builds a different life. The story spans decades and ends in loss. The parallel is the kind of thing a screenwriter would invent, but nobody invented it. Rosemary's granddaughter played a woman whose love was blocked by forces larger than either person. Rosemary's own love had been blocked by a king who believed he answered to something larger than his son's happiness. Rachel married her co-star, Brian Brown, and moved to Australia. She has lived there ever since. There is a street in Hartshill, near the hospital where Edward wept, called Rosemary Ednam Close. That is what remains. A woman who might have been queen, remembered by a street sign in a town that most people have never heard of. I started writing this story because of the tears. The Prince of Wales, standing in a hospital in Staffordshire, weeping for a woman whose name meant nothing to most of the country. I kept going because of what I found behind them. A fortune built on displacement. A mother who left comfort for a war zone. Then a romance. One that should have worked. Destroyed not by the people in it, but by people who were already dead or disgraced. A child killed on a bicycle. And a plane that broke apart over Kent on an afternoon in July. She was building a garden. She was flying home to finish it. She never arrived. Rosemary Leveson Gower was not a queen. She was not a political figure, or a public campaigner, or a woman who left behind a body of work that can be studied and weighed. She left behind 3 sons, 2 of whom survived her, and a memorial garden and a hospital wing, and the memory of a man who never stopped carrying what he felt for her. History did not hold on to her. She has slipped between the footnotes, remembered only by those who go looking. I went looking. This is what I found.